I hate to interrupt Charlie's story over there. Yeah. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 through 17 tonight. Ooh. Is that you or me? A little hot there. Okay, let's start off with a word of prayer, and then we will get into our class. Benny, you're hiding back there in the corner, but I know I gave you a mic, so if you don't mind, will you lead us in prayer?
Our Holy Father, we thank you so much for a good day you've given us today, for the blessings of the day, taking care of us, providing for us as you do. We thank you for this peaceful hour that we have here to study your word. Please be with us in that. Be with Terry and Peyton as they lead our thoughts, and help us to make proper applications to our lives to be more pleasing to you every day, Father. Please forgive us of our sins. Help us when we fall short to do better. Help us to put you first in all that we do and all that we say. These things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. All right. So I wanted to start off with, and we won't be at a Slido for a few minutes. So if you've not joined, it'll have the QR code here in a moment. We're in chapter 2 in the first 17 verses. I wanted to talk about this phrase again because I left last week thinking that maybe we didn't make this clear enough. I don't know, but I understand why sometimes we struggle with the conclusions that the preacher is making, or coleth, as many will call him. But it is all based on this statement. I think that's the thing you've got to keep in mind is he is not thinking the way we think. And I think that's really hard for us to maybe put together. So I wanted to try to explain that a little bit better. Because this phrase, the idea of all is vanity or meaningless occurs 35 times. That's the most repetitive phrase. But 29 times this phrase repeats. And the third phrase that's close is the striving after the wind. You'll see the striving after the wind as well. That shows up a little bit tonight. Here's our challenge. We have been trained, and rightfully so, to think of life with a dual world view. And what we mean by that is, a time that we talked about that was in Revelation, how that Revelation really dealt with a dual world view. Things going on the earth, and at the same time, there's things going on in heaven. And we think about life with a duality of approach. And somewhat, by the way, that's because of Ecclesiastes. That what Ecclesiastes is doing from an ancient mind step is trying to get people to think in this kind of dual worldview. Trying to get them to think above the sun. But when we see the phrase under the sun, he is really just meaning things that are earthly. And so there's a limitation to that. And he's not meaning about spiritual things that happen under the sun. As you go through this, and especially tonight is a really good example of this, he's not thinking about things that are moral or right or spiritual. He's thinking about things like pleasure under the sun, earthly pleasure. Which, by the way, we sing songs that say that earthly pleasure is meaningless. And it's largely based on this concept. And so this under the sun kind of phraseology is a reference to the futile human experience, that everything about humanity in that sense is just futility. And I think that's really a struggle for us to think. And so let me illustrate this way. Evangelism happens under the sun. So we may go, well, when I teach my neighbor the good news, it's under the sun. Well, that's not meaningless. But those are not the kind of things that he's talking about. That's not the thought. Because what he's going to do is he's going to provide a sharp contrast at the end of the book to all these things are meaningless, And that's why you fear God and keep his commandments. Those two things are in conflict with each other. The under the sun and the fearing God and keeping his commandments. And so from that standpoint, and is there some hyperbole? I think the other thing is sometimes we go, well, my family's under the sun. I don't think that's meaningless. And yet in the scope of eternity, even Jesus says that we have to choose eternity over our family. That's the overall point in the book. And it's poetic. And so it's going to say things in a poetic way to make us think about that. Does that make sense at all to explain it that way? And some of it is just, quite frankly, pretty pessimistic at times when you only limit it this way. And that's part of the issue. Any comments, questions about any of that? Nope. Now tonight, there's two key issues that are introduced. One has been introduced already. One is going to be introduced tonight. And these play a role going forward, and they're attached to each other. And they are simply the idea of the fear of death and the fear of being forgotten. That he is afraid of dying without meaning, and what meaning he has accomplished will not be remembered. And that's seen, by the way, if you'll look here in verses 15 and 16. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. For of the wise as of the fool, there's no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come all will have been long forgotten. How the wise dies just like the fool. Now, one of the interesting things there is that, and we'll get to this in a moment, is the contrast he makes and the conclusion he reaches, and he will contradict that in other parts of the book, which is interesting. But here in this passage, what we're seeing is this introduction, and we've already seen this idea that generations come and go mentioned, which is an implication of being forgotten. So, not only is this a problem of death, but this is also a problem of no one's going to remember your accomplishments. And so that ties heavily into the idea of everything under the sun being vanity or meaningless. Is because the conclusion is everybody dies and nobody remembers them. Now, that's where I say this book's pretty pessimistic at times. That's a very pessimistic outlook on life. And I understand that, but that's where the preacher of Ecclesiastes is at. That's where he is at in his presentation. And we'll look at that closer when we get to that point in the text. Again, any comments, questions about any of that to maybe reflect on? Or any of that. Okay. So we are in chapter 2, and there's really two readings tonight that we'll get into. Verses 1 through 11 is a pretty lengthy section. And then verses 12 through 17 is a smaller section, but a powerful one. What I'd like to do then is start off by having somebody read verses 1 through 11 before we have a discussion for that. So, Jared, if you would, 1 through 11, please.
I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with mirth. Therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely this was also vanity. I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of provinces. I acquired males and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kind. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also, my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labors, and this was my reward from all my labor. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done, and on all the labors which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun.
All right, so it's New King James, right? Because it uses the word mirth. What's mirth? Because we don't really talk about going out and pursuing mirth. What is mirth? Anybody? A jolly good time. It is pleasure. So yes, that's the correct answer. Myrrh. Not to be confused with myrrh. But so before we go any further, the Slido here, what does the preacher turn to for pleasure in these verses? And this is the multiple choice answer here. So if you log in there, you have a lot of different options to give you. But what does the preacher turn to for pleasure in this section? I will tell you, as you're answering that one of the interesting things here is that some people, those who think that the chapter 1 may not be maybe more quoted than written, believe that the true introduction to the book starts in chapter 2 and verse 1. And I don't know that I agree with that. I think there's some merit to it, but I'm not sure that that's important enough to really try to battle out one way or another. But it is interesting to see this kind of presentation, and we kind of get to know him on a deeper level. One of the things also to think about this here is in these verse 11 verses is this is almost like a scientific experiment. Might be a good way to put it. So I'm looking for the meaning of life. So my hypothesis is that pleasure under the sun is the meaning of life. So let's go test that. Okay? And that seems to be kind of the idea, and then he reaches a conclusion. So 16 of you have apparently logged in. I don't know how many of you answered, but nobody answered anything but all of the above. And you would be correct that in this section, all of those things are mentioned. And so I think that's interesting, Peyton, to think about. One of the things I thought was interesting when I was saying this is having you as a younger man, as you get older like me and have kids like you, we become more bitter about life. And
so this is why I was asked to do tonight. Okay.
And we also understand the world maybe a little bit differently. I'm not going to say better because, but when you read this section, I think at your age I would have thought, from an under the sun perspective, well, this is what life should be like. Like this is what we should pursue. Pleasure. Let's do all these things. Right?
Somewhat. I don't know about the slaves part, but anything else.
Cultural issue there.
Yeah.
But yes.
No. At one point in time, I would have said yes, probably around high school. For some reason, when you get that driver's license, it's like independence is like just a breath of fresh air, and you just want to do anything and everything. And if I read this at the time, I would have thought that whoever the writer is was crazy. But being 24 now,
so wise.
Not wise at all. None of this sounds appealing. Like a lot of things, like for instance, I did construction, so like verses 4 and 5, like I'd like a nice house. That'd be nice. A great landscape, like a good garden would be cool too, like a pool. But it's like he says, like everything that he put into it just meant nothing. Like for instance, you said it was that he brought out. It was kind of more like an experiment. When he's talking about the wine, it sounded more to me like he was, like you said, like a scientist. Like it didn't sound like he was getting intoxicated off of it. It was more like he was tasting it, trying to see what the hype, or what the infatuation, what the interest is all about. So like there was that certain thing, and I do think it got to a point where he kind of lost what he was doing from the beginning. But yeah, no, as a younger person, there's some of these things in here that sounds pretty interesting. I mean, it sounds pretty nice.
Yeah, I think one of the things, the theme in wisdom literature is that if you'll notice here, this idea of laughter and pleasure is introduced. And in things like the Proverbs, you see that laughter and pleasure are often what hides grief and sorrow. And so in some ways, it's as if he's saying, well, I'm trying to figure out, how do you find the meaning of human life? It's not grief and sorrow, so maybe laughter and pleasure being the cover for that is where to find that.
It's funny, also, what I got from that too is in Proverbs 10:23, it talks about fools laughing on the road to destruction. There were some times in my high school days where I did some pretty stupid things, and I would laugh about it and be like, oh man, that was good times. But there's some people that laugh about the memories and be like, oh man, that was fun, we should do that again. And you just keep going down that road. You can keep digging that hole, just laughing at,
And
the
there's
kind of
some
vanity
people
things,
who've still
the
not
meaningless
grown out
things.
of that
No.
at my age, to
Yeah.
be honest with you. Let's talk a little bit about a few things here. The pursuit of wine, I'm not sure we should read this as that he's just trying to get drunk so he forgets his problems. It's the idea of indulging upon this as an experience, but not to the point of total loss of control. Some have suggested that it was more of the idea of wine tasting and understanding than even drinking to a point that it altered. Some have suggested that it altered slightly, but there's nothing here to make us think that he's inebriated. It's more that this is an idea of, hey, people enjoy this. Let's see if this is a source of pleasure. And he does that. He then goes on to list his accomplishments. And, he has built his house and has these gardens and vineyards. And by the way, the slave comment follows that. And I think that should be seen as almost the equivalent of, if you modernize that today, it would be like, my estate is so big, I had to hire gardeners,
Right, yeah.
and groundskeepers to be able to do it. Because it's so massive, I can't do it by myself. And so that's the idea here, is he is, and it just happens that in that culture, and by the way, slavery under the Torah was nowhere near as barbaric as we think. I mean, you had the year of Jubilee that released them from their slavery, and you had people that asked to remain because it was more beneficial for their family. And I think that's hard for us to remember sometimes. But he had slaves. What the implication is he is a good slave owner because he has slaves born in his house. So these are people that have petitioned to remain as slaves under his oversight. And that only happened when it was a good slave owner. So he's really bragging then about the success of his estate and how much he's been able to do. Mm-hmm. And then he gets into his herds and flocks, that he has more livestock than anybody else that's been there before. And then wealth. And by the way, the implication here is this is one of those passages that does seem to tie to Solomon as being the author. It sounds a whole lot like him in these things. Especially this wealth is tied to the idea of the wealth of a government, taking in taxation, profiting. And we know that, when Solomon is king, that he has amassed more than anybody else before him. So all of these descriptions would fit. He had singers. And then I noticed that this is a passage that, I don't know if it overlooked it, Jared, or had a different word. I was trying to pay attention. But In the ESV and some of the newer translations, it mentions concubines here. And listen, in the context here, we just need to realize that what's really at play here is he's pursuing sexual pleasure as an answer to life. And he is doing it in a way that would have been seen in that ancient culture. This is the kind of thing that delights this up to verse 8. He says, these are the things that delight the sons of man. This is where mankind finds his earthly pleasure. Now, when you think about today, and you think about all the things up there, and maybe we don't think about music as much even though it's there, but especially accomplishments, wine or some kind of chemical influence, sexual gratification, wealth. I mean, those four especially, those are on the top of our culture's list of things to pursue. And that's how you know that you're happy and successful and your life has value, if you have those things. And by the way, if you're a young person, those are the things that you see on social media.
All the time.
That's what's promoted. And so that's what is put up as the standard. And so that's one of the reasons why this book, I think, is timely, right? Is because the world hasn't changed that much. All that's changed is the technology, but the actual things have not changed that much. And so he says here, and verse 9 is really interesting because he says, I'm the greatest in Jerusalem. And I did all of this, by the way, that my wisdom still remained with me. And verse 10, whatever I wanted, here's interesting, whatever my eyes wanted, I gave myself. I didn't tell myself no at all. And I think this is in the context of trying to figure out if pleasure is the solution to life. And so he considers all of this. What's the conclusion? Anybody? It's vanity. I mean, he sets out to prove this hypothesis that this pleasure and laughter is what life is about, and he comes back and says, that ain't it. That's essentially what this phrase means. That's not it. This is not what's important. Pleasure.
You also see the desire to grow every time. I mean, it first starts with, let me try a little bit of wine. Then it goes to, okay, let me upgrade my house a little bit, the backyard, make it look nice. Then it goes from, actually, I need people to maintain. So he adds that. Then he goes to, well, I need something to do while everybody's doing my job for me. I need entertainment, right? Yep. Okay, well, I need people to listen with me to keep me, because I'm lonely. I mean, it just keeps adding and adding up. I mean,
there's a bunch of layers
in
here. At the end of that, he's amassed what we would call success, this huge estate, and it's meaningless to him. Yes, Lord.
That's why a lot of times you see people with an outlandish amount of money buy strange things to us. We think, well, I wouldn't spend they're looking for something.
Right.
Buy one thing, it's not enough. It's never enough.
Right.
It's that feeling that you buy something new, even all of us, you buy something new, and after a while it's like,
or you want something really bad and you finally get it, and you're not even really enjoying it before you want something else really bad.
Well, and it's not to say that you can't, do those things to improve self,
right?
home, but if that's what's filling you up, and for all of us, we are not made to be satisfied.
Yeah.
Earthly.
I think a key there too is you said, Lord, if that's what's filling you up, and I think part of his point is you think it will, but it won't.
No, you think so.
Yeah.
And it's the outland, and you kind of feel sorry for people that they're buying these outlandish things, which I don't, whatever they want to do.
Right.
But that it is such a strain to do better, more, and there's no limit to the money, but there's certainly a limit to the happiness, the satisfaction.
Yeah, it's been said that we're the wealthiest country. We're also one of the most anxious and depressed countries. And I just think it's interesting how in our minds we think those two things don't go together. But it seems like they do. That the pursuit of more is never satisfying. And that's part of what he's getting at here. And again, I think that's part of what we're supposed to learn. And I think, listen, I think a huge part of Ecclesiastes is an attempt for us to learn from his mistakes rather than learn the hard way. The problem with that is, and I'll say it's about both of us. Up here is two guys that have always had to learn the hard way. I could pick on Peyton and say, well, I've tried to tell him and he just won't listen. But the reality is, that's just him being like me. I mean, I was the same way. And most of us are. Because we think somehow we're going to be different than what has happened to other people. Anything else to put there, Peyton, to add to that?
I had one thing, kind of we were talking about the whole wine, if he was getting intoxicated, if it was more like him just trying to see how the taste is. There was a phrase that was in my passage here in verse 3 that says, my heart's still guiding me with wisdom. Some have used this specific phrase to say that he never drank enough to actually be intoxicated. But I think either way, it's more important that the writer is carefully weighing the significance of the act as it relates to his search for the actual meaning that he's looking for. So that was really the only thing I had.
That's a good point. All right, let's move to the next section, verses 12 through 17. John, will you read that?
Verse 12. Then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who succeeds the king? Only what he has already done. Then I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said in my heart, this also is vanity, for there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever, since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? As the fool. Therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all is vanity and grasping for the wind.
Okay, there's a Slido for this before we get in. What do wisdom and folly have in common? This is a pretty simple question probably. What do wisdom and folly have in common? Now, as you're answering that, this is connected to something in this section that we've already talked about that really helps us understand his mindset and going forward, and why it feels so pessimistic a little bit because of what we see here. It should be pointed out when it comes to wisdom. By the way, I was thinking today, going over my notes and everything, that the first 11 verses, because it's about wine and sex and earthly success and those kind of things, we all probably are on board with that. We're all probably like, yeah, that stuff, because those are the things like I said Sunday morning, how that we always went back and forth between Acts and teenage moral issues and growing up in our Bible class in church. And all the things in those first 11 verses are the things that we talked about in our teenage moral issues class, of things you should avoid, right? And so there's a part of us that looks at that and goes, yeah, that's right. Those things aren't valuable. They're meaningless. Don't pursue those. And then he goes and he says, so then I turn my mind back to wisdom and folly. And at the end of this short discussion about wisdom, he comes to the same conclusion. Now, this one challenges us more than the last one, because we'll look at those other things as these are bad things to do and pursue. But wisdom is, we're supposed to pursue wisdom. And so it's interesting. Now, the interest here is they both die. They both have the same end. And that really is what changes his mind here. He talks about, and even in this section here, he talks about, as John read for us, that wisdom is better than folly because he uses this analogy of light and darkness, that those who walk in wisdom, it's the idea of blindness almost. They can see, and those who walk in folly, they're blinded. They're in darkness. They cannot see. And so he says that wisdom is preferred, and then all of a sudden he goes, but they both die. So why did I pursue wisdom? By the way, this kind of reasoning, does it remind you of any other Old Testament book? That's a trick question. No? It's a lot like Job in some of its reasoning. Because Job talks about, his friends are like, well, this happened to you because you're a bad guy. And he's like, nope, same thing happens to the good and the bad.
A lot of thinking out loud.
A lot of thinking out loud. And that's part of what's going on here is almost stream of consciousness or thinking out loud, reasoning through things. So, help me make sense of this. I mean, we tell everybody wisdom is a good thing, and he's basically at the end of that, why did I even pursue wisdom? After he said wisdom is able to walk with sight and folly is darkness or blindness. Any thoughts there? You're laughing. Go ahead.
No, it's funny. I was just quickly reading this thing from, I don't even know what it is. I guess it's a commentary, but it says, as we increase in knowledge and have the wisdom to use it in the right way, we are more able to understand the complexities of life under the sun. Through the study of philosophy, sociology, psychology, man is more able to understand its own nature. The writer is able to look at his behavior and address its idiosyncrasies and imperfections. The only trouble is that he is unable to do anything to change them. I just thought that was kind of funny. I mean, it's exactly, he's thinking it out loud. He's realizing, all these things I've done, it's really meaningless and kind of wasted.
It's almost that idea that the more you know, the more you realize what you don't know. And remember, if under the sun is about the futility of human life, then how is the pursuit of wisdom futility? That's the hard thing. What? What's your random thought?
Oh man, I just forgot. Man.
That's so convenient.
Wisdom just went right out. I don't want it. Is that okay?
You don't have to. Yeah, you don't have to.
Every step's in. Okay, because it's like, okay, come back.
All right, anybody else? How is the pursuit of wisdom, how does it become futile?
I just understood it that it just means nothing in the end. It doesn't matter. And he talks about all of his accomplishments, and so wisdom goes along. It doesn't matter how many books you've read or how much you study or if you author your own books, you're still going to die in the end. And you're really, it means nothing. It doesn't put off death. It doesn't change anything. You're going to die the same way as the fool dies.
Okay?
I don't remember what I was going to say.
Yep.
Okay, I wrote it down so I didn't forget. So it's all about remembering the point of who we're doing this for, right? So he wanted he was like, okay, I'm going to test this out and do all these pleasures that are on the earth, and then whether I do all these fun things that seem fun on the earth, or I live in a way that God wants, what's the difference in the end? Because I'm going to die, not going to be remembered. But the point is to focus on why am I doing this, and who am I doing this for, and what is the purpose. And
That
is the spiritual.
Yeah, that will be the point.
Okay.
And that's the hard thing, I think, to understand is that in this section of the book, all these things he's doing for himself. And that's another way of looking at the under the sun is that's a self-centered approach to life. So part of what he's doing is he's painting this picture of seeking pleasure for self, seeking wisdom for self. Those things are not fulfilling. They're meaningless. There's no value. Seeking God at the end of the book That's what the conclusion is. At the end of the book, I've tried all this stuff to make myself happy and to make myself be what I want. None of that works. It's meaningless. It's striving for a win. Fearing God, that works. And by the way, we won't get into this necessarily tonight, but I'm not certain how much knowledge he has of the afterlife and resurrection and all of that, because during the Old Testament times, it's not as clear. That is part of the mystery revealed through Christ, which was purposely kept dim for hundreds of years until it was fully revealed. And so for us to think that he has the knowledge of eternity and resurrected life and all of those things like we do, that is ignoring God's plan to purposely keep certain things hidden until the right time. Benny.
Well, and maybe to a smaller degree, can it be that while they both have the same end, the navigation of life is different? The fools in darkness, but the wise at least see.
As ours, yeah.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think one of the things here is, because he's going to take the stance later on, he's not taking a stance necessarily that wisdom should not be pursued. He's still saying it's better to have wisdom than folly, but earthly wisdom and earthly folly both lead to death, and nobody remembers you. And that's the ultimate conclusion here. And seeing that in days to come, all will have been long forgotten. I mean, when you just think about that phrase, that's really a pessimistic view of life, isn't it? And yet, if I go to, there's a cemetery outside of Owensboro, Kentucky called the Rouse Cemetery. That's where my family on my mom's side is buried. And if you go beyond my grandfather and only a few of his close relatives, I don't know anybody in that cemetery. And I've been told stories about people in that cemetery, but I know nothing about them. I don't even know, I can't even put them in the family tree for you. And so there's a point where he's right. And once we get beyond the grandparent generation, the majority of us struggle to know anything about our family, long distance. Now maybe for you, like my father-in-law, the family tree was a hobby, but for me, it's not. And so from that standpoint, and to some degree for my kids, because my father died before they were born, they don't really know anything about him except for that he's my father. There's no memories, no stories to tell. They don't know my grandmother or my grandfather. I didn't know my grandfather. So again, long forgotten, very pessimistic. And so at the end of this, it's this same idea that what is done is grievous. And it's just striving after the wind. We're not going to answer this just because I think we get it. What's his great fear? Just tell me out loud. What's his great fear? Being forgotten. And I think we might read this and think it's death, but it's actually being forgotten, not being remembered. Death is inescapable, and I think he's wise enough in his wisdom to know that. But not having a legacy is something that he cannot handle. And that's interesting. Now, put in the context of if this is Solomon, as many think, there's a part of that that's not true, and yet there's a part of that what he is remembered for is not great. It's kind of like Rahab. I mean, how would you like for thousands of years to be remembered as the harlot rather than somebody who brought the Messiah to the world? You ever thought about that? Like, we don't think about Rahab, I forget which great-grandmother to Jesus she is. We think about Rahab, the harlot. And so even when we're remembered sometimes, we're remembered for our worst and not our best.
I mean, even if it was Solomon or just a random person, or even if this story was made up and was, based on Solomon's life, I mean, either way, to have all these things that he obtained, had all this wealth, had all this power, only for him to realize probably late at night when he's laying in bed, can't fall asleep, none of that means anything.
Yeah,
You know,
and
it
I'm-
must be shattering, or, you know, the realization at least. But.
And to be clear, I'm not going to make a big deal out of being Solomon or not. If it is Solomon, I think it is. Like I think Jamie said last week, it's at the end of his life and he's reflecting. If it's not Solomon, it's somebody who's reflecting on his life. I still think he's the pattern regardless. Ralph?
Was it Shakespeare that said the evil that men do lives after them?
Maybe. I'm not a Shakespeare guy. Is that right? Is it Shakespeare that said the evil that men do lives after them? She teaches Shakespeare, but apparently not very good. What?
We'll say it's Shakespeare. Yeah.
Is it Shakespeare? It's Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's true. It's true. Gary Hamilton said it was Shakespeare. So it's true. We only have like 5 minutes left, so let's get to a couple of questions. What have you learned from the reading? All is vanity. That's going to be the same answer every week. All is vanity. None of this matters. Like that's.
Again, I mean, it's similar to what we learned last week. Like you said, all is vanity. Pursuing the earthly things don't mean anything. But then when we start looking at spiritual things, that's the legacy that we live. Because, you know, everybody came to be a part of Jesus' church a different way. And I look at my family tree, and my grandfather left Roman Catholic Church to become a member of the church. And then he taught my dad actually taught my mom. And then now, hopefully, my kids will one day be a part of it. Sage already is, and their kids. And that's the legacy that we hope to live. So
That's a great point.
Yeah. It's like a college preacher that I went to in Florida. He said, don't worry about your earthly legacy, worry about your eternity. You know, that's what's more permanent, yeah.
John?
Yeah, I don't think I would say I learned from the reading, but just from this class is next time I hear the term Rahab, I'm going to talk the good about her
Yeah.
and not the bad.
Yeah. I think
And I feel pretty confident I would have said that yesterday. I would have brought up her lineage
Yeah.
and where she was at first. Just because I think that's what we're supposed to do.
I think
It's shine light, not dark.
one of the things we can learn from the reading is to try to remember people for their good.
Yeah.
You know, because I think that is a fear that we all have, is not being remembered for the good that we've done. So if that's our fear, then we need to change it now so the next generation sees a better way.
And it's our motivation. What's our
Yeah.
motivation? Not to be forgotten. We
Yeah.
want God. We want to do things for God or do things that glorify God.
Right.
If we're worried about how we are perceived ourselves,
Yeah.
that's definitely striving to do.
Yeah, and maybe the greater point, John, when I think about it, is not so much to remember Rahab necessarily for what she did, but what God did with Rahab and what God can do with me. Because I think at the end, the conclusion is not to remember me as much as remember God, and God is the one who has the power. Where do you fall short, according to this reading? I mean, the humorous answer is I fall short in pursuing too much wisdom, right? But did you have that one down?
Yeah.
Where do you fall short, do you think?
Well, like I say, if you are doing things for your own personal glory,
Yep.
we do that a lot. We don't realize it all the time, but we would like to be known as someone who's, you know, not a pariah of the community or something like that. We'd like that, but I mean, some people's motivation, sometimes we get more full of ourselves about it.
Yeah, we want to be memorialized a little bit. I had a mechanic one time that he was an elder of the congregation I was at, where I was training, and my car was in there, and another person's car was in there. My car got out in 3 days, and the other person's it took 3 weeks. I said, Kenneth, why did you get my car done so quick and Dave's car's still in there? He said, well, when it comes to preachers, you never know who's going to speak at your funeral. And you laugh about that, but sometimes we do wonder what will be said about us, not just at our funeral, but long term.
I think for me, with this, is especially with just financially, with how everything's going on, inflation, obviously, with the world, it's really hard to not focus on monetary gain rather than spiritual gain when it really matters. So that's what I'd say I'd fall short of.
Good thought. What do you need to change according to this reading? It's probably all connected. But anybody? I think a big thing for me is just realizing priorities. At the end of the day, what really does matter? I think one of the things that does matter in here, by the way, is having the wisdom to view things correctly. I do think that's implied here, even we're really out of time, but what habits do we need to develop according to this chapter? What are some habits, maybe? Megan?
I don't know if it's a habit, but contentment is what I was thinking of, because there's never enough. You get the next thing and it's not enough. So contentment, maybe.
Yep, that's a good one. Anybody else? Any thoughts?
Not with this. No. I mean, with me, just what I kind of answered the last question, just make sure you're maintaining your ultimate spiritual goal. Keep your focus on the right things. Limit the distractions.
I think much of this book is about perspective. Keeping your perspective right of what matters. And as much as we like to say that we try to live above the sun, the fact is we're pretty consumed with things under the sun. Whether that's our finances or our careers or the state of our country or our relationships. If we're not careful, those really do become our focus and our drive. And part of this is calling us to think differently, to look at life differently, that the things under the sun, striving for those things, making that, and that's a key word, striving for those things, making those things your focus, is like trying to grasp the wind. It's meaningless. It doesn't have value. Thanks, Peyton, for sitting in. I will not be here Sunday or Wednesday, by the way. So I will be in Louisville, Kentucky, and I've got Friday night a singing and Saturday a men's workshop day that I'm teaching, and then a meeting Sunday through Wednesday. So when I get home Thursday, I'll be tired, but I'll be looking forward to seeing you then. And guys are filling in for me. So appreciate it, and I'll see you a week from Sunday. Thank you.